Alright, so this is going to be the first of hopefully many black walnut videos for me. You know, black walnuts are one of the trees that I'm most passionate about. And as we moved through the black walnut season here in 2023, I really was unsure what exactly I wanted this first video to be like, what exactly I wanted it to be about. And so I kind of just moved through the season. You know, it's a very busy time of year, and I just tried to record all the steps of the process, you know, basically record everything I'm doing with black walnut, and I figured out later in editing how I want to actually structure the videos. But anyway, the way it's working out is I think this first video, it's going to be a little long, and it's going to be kind of an intro to the processing mostly, as well as a little bit of an introduction just to black walnut as a tree. And then in the future, I'm planning to make more videos diving into the individual steps, hopefully in more detail. You know, specifically, like I might make a dedicated video on different ways to crack the black walnuts, kind of talking more about that, or cooking with black walnuts. Maybe we can make one about black walnuts' ecological role, or the history of black walnuts, or just one about why I love them so much, you know, kind of my love story with black walnuts. But anyway, last thing I'll say before we duck into the actual, you know, the video, the footage, the exciting stuff, is that all this information I'm conveying about black walnuts, I've learned through either experience or from other folks, especially on YouTube. You know, I've gotten a lot of ideas and inspiration here on YouTube. So anyway, a lot of this is shared ideas. I'm not sure if y'all can hear, but the cat really wants to come outside, so I gotta go play with the kitty. Yeah, I know. But last thing, I do feel it's important to add, if you are watching this because you're interested in trying to consume black walnuts for the first time, anytime you're going to consume a wild food, make sure you do plenty of research on your own. Don't just watch one video and go start eating stuff. You know, black walnuts are a pretty safe one to get into, generally speaking, but anytime you eat a wild food, you need to take that responsibility onto yourself to know exactly what the plant looks like, know what any risks might be, so forth and so on. Just make sure you're well informed. Well educated on what you're doing. All right, so it's black walnut season. It's actually well into black walnut season. We're in early November here. Black walnuts are one of my favorite trees. If I had to pick a favorite tree, they'd be really high up there, possibly number one. They're definitely one of my biggest tree teachers, the black walnut is. And there's no way I could cram all of my thoughts around black walnut into one YouTube video, but I'm going to do my best to try and make this kind of an all-around a little bit about black walnut just generally, and then also a lot about how to gather, process, store, and crack the nuts if you're going to eat them. A little bit about planting the nuts here too. I like to pick them up with this tool. It's called a nut wizard. There's a lot of different designs. You can get it, you know, the brand that I get it from is called Nut Wizard, but this like nut collector thing, there's a ton of different brands. So you can sometimes find them at hardware stores. I got this one online. You can probably find them on Amazon. They're all over. You just type in like black walnut gatherer or nut wizard if you want this one specifically. I know it might sound weird to Google that on the internet, but trust me, it leads right to this tool. You can pick them up by hand for sure, and I've done a lot of that. And I actually think in a lot of ways it's more fun to pick them up by hand. You feel more connected to the foraging and just what you're doing. But if you're going to collect a lot of nuts, you're going to save a lot of time by using this tool. It's so fast. I mean, you can fill a 5-gallon bucket in like under a minute or two with this thing when the nuts are really heavy under a tree. You know, like with all nut trees, you want to try to focus on a tree that's having a big year, where there's a lot of black walnuts on the ground, which when they have a big year, you know, and they carpet the ground. I mean, they are so abundant here, and they grow a lot in the East Coast and the Midwest. So anyway, the first step is to gather the nuts. The second step is you want to get the husk off, typically as fast as you can, but it doesn't really matter if they sit around for a little bit. I find if you're doing this by hand, I mean, I know I'm showing a drill right now, but this is still kind of a by hand method compared to some of the more industrial hulling machines that are out there. If you're doing this on an at-home scale, I don't like to let the nuts dry out. It's totally fine to leave them in the husk for a while and let them start to rot in the husk. That actually makes it easier to get the nuts out of the husk. But if that husk starts to dry out, in my experience, it starts to kind of adhere to the shell. It's really hard to get it off. So I don't like to let them dry out, but they can sit around for a little bit. And we're going to talk about several different ways to go about processing the black walnut. There's a lot of ways to do it. I'm not going to cover all of them. I basically either do it with my hands and feet or with a drill, like how you just saw, where you're basically putting them into some water in a bucket hitting them with a drill and a paint mixer. What I would actually not recommend doing is what I just did, where I used a battery-powered drill. This process is really hard on a battery-powered drill, and you might not be able to beat the nuts up hard enough with a drill like that. It's really good to use a corded drill, like you'll see me using later in the video. It just helps to have that extra juice. If you're going to be processing them with the drill and the water like this, you're going to make a lot of mess. There's going to be a lot of liquid running off of your operation, and I think it's important to consider what you're doing with that liquid. I was just dumping some of it around the base of a seedling black walnut tree. I think that's a great way to do it. If you have black walnut trees in your landscape, use it to water black walnuts. I like to do it a lot in big mulched areas where there's going to be wood chips to soak up some of that water. It's important to note too, like the husk extract from black walnut. People certainly dye with it. They use it to create dyes. So if you or someone you know likes to make dyes, you could capture that liquid. I think you might have to like boil it down or something. I don't know a lot about dye making, but you could certainly try to capture the liquid for making dyes, for fabric or wood. When the hulls are super fresh, you could actually process them into a medicine because they have somewhat of an anti-parasitic deworming effect. Some people certainly use black walnut hulls as medicine. I'm not sure how to make it, but I know that that is a use for these hulls. I think they have to be fresh. Once they've started to rot down, I think it's probably not great to be using this for medicine. So like I a lot of the times just either compost these hulls and the liquid or put it into wood chipped areas or dump it around black walnut trees. It's probably not wise to dump this directly onto garden plants. You know, there is some evidence of black walnut having negative effects on other plants. This is highly talked about in the gardening world, although in nature it seems to rarely happen. It seems, especially with native plants and other woody perennials, it seems very rare that black walnut negatively affects native plants and woody perennials. But just to play on the safe side, I wouldn't go dumping this water on your tomato plants or your garden, just because of possible negative effects. Like I said, we're going to talk about a couple other ways to process black walnuts. You can see I'm using a slightly different container now. I don't find that these containers work as well as the 5-gallon buckets. The black walnuts don't get to bounce around off each other as much, and so they don't, like, that's a big mechanism in the bucket, is it's the black walnuts grinding on themselves, kind of shredding up that husk material. And you can see here, there's a lot of husk left that I'm kind of picking off of a lot of these nuts, and they're going to go back in, you know, the ones that have a lot of husk, they're going to go back in and get reprocessed. I really like to use a larger drum, like a trash can size drum, like 35 to 55 gallons. You can see this big pile of hulls that I've got and all this liquid sitting around that I'm slowly taking one bucket at a time to different black walnut trees out in the landscape. But that would be my recommendation if you're going to use the drill, is to try to get a larger container. If not, use the 5-gallon buckets or just whatever you got, and it'll all work. But larger container that is circular seems to be the right tool for the job for me. And if I'm alone trying to process a lot of black walnuts, I like the drill because it feels faster to me than anything else that I've done. But it's by far more pleasant to do it by hand with a group of people. I routinely have gotten together with folks and kind of had parties, black walnut processing parties. And it's just kind of like everybody gathers around and does this, whole deal here where you're kind of stepping on the walnuts, and then that's getting most of the husk off, and then you can kind of use your hands to peel the rest and do a little bit of a sorting process, throw all the nuts into a bucket and throw the hulls into a pile. It's just really fun to gather around with folks and do it. You will almost always see these little worms or maggots in the husk. That is totally okay. They do not harm the walnuts. You'll see a lot of them. Chickens and birds love to eat those maggots, so if you have a bunch of hulls with some of those worms, you can throw those to the chickens. They'll love it. They might get a little bit of deworming action going on from the hulls. So, and this is the size drum that I like to use when I'm doing the drill method, right? Another really common method is to just run the black walnuts over with your car or your truck, put them out in the driveway and just run them over a bunch. People talk about doing that all the time. You can throw black walnuts into a corn husker, or a corn sheller is really the thing. It has like a crank, and it's for basically getting the kernels off of dry flour corn. You can put black walnuts through those. I've seen people do some other fancy stuff, rigging up old farm equipment to kind of turn them into makeshift hulling machines at a slightly more industrial scale. So there's like I said, there's no way I could shove all of my walnut thoughts into one video, but get creative and There's a lot of different ways to process the hulls off of these nuts, and that's the biggest part of the labor, in my opinion, with black walnuts, is getting the husks off. And here, it's hard to manage this big drill with one hand, and I didn't have my tripod out. But this is the gist. You gotta, with this method, you gotta really beat them up for a few minutes. You want to just have that drill just ripping for, like I said, 1, 2, 3, probably at the most 5 minutes. Do a little 1.5 minute intervals or something like that. That way you're not just pulling the trigger for 5 minutes straight, but you might overheat the drill. But yeah, you really beat them up. The water gets all bubbly, and you'll hear kind of a sound that sounds like golf balls banging around against each other, and that's the black walnuts clanking around in the bottom of the bucket. That lets you know that they're mostly done. And then from here, what I like to do is pour a lot of this liquid through some sort of straining implement. So I use milk crates, but you could use screens or any sort of thing. Pour all the liquid through that so that you can try to catch a lot of the good black walnuts, and then kind of sort out the husk and stuff. Here you can see I have a literal screen that I'm using. But like I said, I sometimes use milk crates, and I can only do a little bit at a time because it all just overflows. There's probably a more efficient way to set this up, but this worked for me. And I forget, this is my 3rd or 4th year doing black walnuts in this, in a rather large quantity for a backyard scale. And every year it looks a little bit different. I'm kind of always, iterating and changing my process. You can see I'm not using gloves. I would definitely recommend using gloves if it's your first time, partly because black walnut will stain your fingers. I don't mind the stain, but that stain stays on your fingers for weeks. But some folks can have an allergic reaction to black walnut if it's touches their skin. I think it's kind of rare, but it's just important to mention, be careful your first time exposing yourself to these things. My skin doesn't seem to be too bothered by it, so I just don't wear gloves because I don't really like wearing gloves. But you can see the bottom of the bucket is when you really get a massive amount of nuts, and they're all pretty clean. They could be cleaner, but for the drill method, this is about as clean as they get. Oh, I should mention another method that folks sometimes use to clean these is throwing them in a cement mixer. Maybe throw a few rocks in there too, and just let the cement mixer run for a little bit. That's another really good way to do it. So once you get your nuts clean, it's important to dump them into a bucket of water, because you're looking for nuts that float, and you can see me peeling off some husk there, because sometimes if there's a little bit of husk left on the nut, they can float from that attached piece of husk. So you want them to be fully clean of the husk. Dump them into water, and the ones that float I would typically discard. That means they probably have an air pocket or bug damage, or they're not fully developed. I tend to throw them somewhere where they either go into the compost or the mulch, or somewhere where they might have a chance to germinate, because occasionally a viable nut will float. You never know. It's not 100%, but for going through the next step in the process, putting in the effort to dry these nuts and store them, I want to make sure that I'm storing only viable nuts. So to dry them or cure them, at least for the first few days, you want them to be a stacked single layer. So I'm using an old dog cage here, propped up on some wood out in my barn. Any way that you can get them stacked single layer is good. I try to keep them out of direct sunlight, although I'm not really sure how important that is. I like to keep them a little bit shaded. I'm lucky that my barn, there's no squirrels anywhere even remotely close, so I can get away with doing this first step of the drying part outside. If you have squirrels, you're probably not going to be able to pull that off. Squirrels will go through a stash of nuts so fast. So keep an eye on your nuts. Be cognizant and aware of wildlife pressure in your area. After a few days, you'll notice that the nuts are starting to feel a lot drier. By touch, these are still really wet and fresh. Once they're dry to the touch, you can stack them up if you need to let them finish curing and drying. And I typically use milk crates so that there's still pretty good airflow to the nuts. I've seen other people use like onion bags, and there's various methods for. You still want to have airflow while they're drying. At least for the 2, 3, 4 weeks after they're done being freshly processed out of the husk. During the drying process, you might see some yellow sort of I don't know if it's mold or yeast or I don't know what it is, but you might see some yellow growth on some of the nuts. That's typically not an issue. It's not penetrating the shell. If it makes you uncomfortable, you can toss those away. It's typically a small percentage of the nuts get that, but all it is it's something decomposing any small remaining bits of husk material that are left on the nut. I typically try to get mine really clean with a pressure washer for eating, although you don't have to. If they're not perfectly clean, it just means they're going to be a little bit dusty after they're dried down. It's totally harmless. These nuts you're looking at here are not fully clean because this is how I store them for seed. You can either direct plant them in the fall. I've talked a lot in other videos about seed saving and seed starting for different trees. Black walnuts are pretty standard as far as trees go, but I store them in buckets with mixed in with wood chips like you saw there, and the buckets have holes drilled in them and screens on top to protect them from squirrels. And you can store the walnuts until spring this way. Or like I said, you can direct plant them if you want to. I prefer to direct plant, but I oftentimes don't have space and time to do all that in the fall, so I got to put them in storage. It is good to insulate these buckets a little bit with some wood chips or some leaves, leaf bags or straw or something throughout the worst part of winter. All right, so now the fun part. Now it's time. Our black walnuts, we gathered them, we dehusked them, we dried them, and now we're going to crack them open. There's several different ways to go about this. I'm going to show you in a minute here a dedicated black walnut cracker, but if you don't have one of those, you can totally get by with some rock on rock action. I like this rock because it's smooth, it's a good size for my hand. You want to be very careful to keep your fingers out of the way, and it's all about repetition, a lot of light taps. You don't want to do one big massive swing of the rock because that'll just send pieces flying everywhere. You want to do small repetitive strikes until you'll hear a definitive crack when the nut when you get that first crack, and you just keep going at it lightly and you'll be able to peel it apart. Now this nut you can see is kind of shriveled up and black. This is not what you want. You can eat these. I've eaten these plenty of times before. They have not made me sick. I don't find they taste great. I've given them to other people, and some people say they taste really good. Some people are like, nah, not so good. You want them to look, well, I'll show you what a good one looks like, but it's important to know that every now and then you'll get one like this that's a little bit shriveled up, and it won't hurt you, but I don't think they're the best to eat. You'll see on this next nut here what you would want to see. You can do this with a hammer as well. It helps to choke up on the hammer real close, to the hammer bit. You don't want to be holding it all the way down at the end of that handle. You want a lot of control. I think it's also important the way that you orient the nut. Most nuts I find like to crack on the tip, like how I am holding it here. If you're swinging at it and you're not getting any, it's not giving at all, you can try changing the orientation and see if it cracks better that way. Each tree makes nuts that are kind of different. So there was one little piece that came out, and you just kind of keep tapping away at it. And it's the same deal. It's just, a bunch of repetitive, light, short strikes with the hammer. And you can see the nut meat is exposed there, but I can't quite pry it out, so I'm going to just very slightly tap it, being careful at this stage. It's really easy to smash the nut meat, so you got to be really gentle. And then you can just wiggle out. You can see that piece broke there a little bit, but sometimes you can wiggle out whole pretty big pieces. Notice the color on this piece of walnut is, kind of looks much more walnut-like than that last one that was all dark and shriveled up. It's also more filled out, as you can see here. This is what you want. That's a good tasting walnut. And there will be variation in color and size between different nuts. Some black walnuts will have a slightly darker brown. Some will be more tan, kind of like your traditional walnut. There's a lot of variation from tree to tree in all characteristics. Color, flavor, size, thickness of shell, ease of cracking out. That's a nice piece right there. That's what you want. You want those quarters, whole quarters. Kind of a funny saying, but whole quarters is what we're after here with a black walnut. Or whole halves is really, that's pretty rare with black walnuts, but it is possible to crack out and get a whole half of a nut. And if you're not aware, there are cultivars of black walnut that have been either selected, found in the wild, or, bred through breeding programs of various scales to have thinner shells and to crack out easier. And there's a lot of improvement to be done still, but they're getting, the improved cultivars are, crazy thin compared to the wild nuts. I don't have any to show you right now. I've seen some at conferences and things like that, but as you can see, my house gets pretty crazy and full of nuts this time of year. There's just black walnuts everywhere. Other than eating them raw, my favorite thing is to cook, bake them into brownies and cookies, and I can leave my favorite baked black walnut baked good recipe in the description here. And next I'm going to show you this dedicated cracker, but this is mixing up a black walnut, and actually acorn flour went into this, but a black walnut and acorn flour brownie. So yeah, we'll get to the nutcracker. This is me direct planting some black walnuts. I'll talk more about this strategy in other videos, but those are some beginning thoughts on black walnut. It's kind of diving in on what you can do with black walnut, a few ways to process. Like I said, I mean, I could just talk for hours and hours and hours about black walnut. So if you want to hear more, let me know. Ask any questions you might have, or I'm really excited to just keep talking about black walnuts. But that is the gist. Hopefully enough to get you started if you're new to it, or maybe some interesting takes if you've been doing this a while. Who knows? I think the biggest change in how I processed black walnuts this year compared to last year was using a pressure washer. And you can see this is an example of how clean you can get them with the pressure washer, which is really nice. Like I said, it's not necessary, but it's nice. These other ones, like this one right here, I processed last year without a pressure washer. And you can see there's a lot of dried husk material. It just makes a lot of dust. So if you're, cleaning nuts or cracking nuts in the kitchen, it's just a little dusty. Not the end of the world, but definitely, if you can get access to a pressure washer, that's great. I got one used for pretty cheap, just a little electric one. So this is the black walnut cracker that I like to use. You can see you just pull back to adjust that, and you can adjust the screw for different sized nuts. I kind of just let it come to its resting position. It's very important to keep your hand over the nut, and I tried the tooth, right? And that tooth didn't work, so you saw I moved to the next tooth. That cracked it. That's all you got to do, and it's cracked. And then most of the time, you just have to peel apart the shell, and you can see we're exposing a lot of large pieces of the walnut here. Typically, what I'll do is, I'm not trying to bend over a tripod. I have like a little bowl in front of me, and I'm just picking out good pieces, throwing them in a bowl, throwing the shells in a bag or whatever to take to the compost or the mulch. And you can go through nuts pretty quickly this way. Every now and then you'll get, and it depends on every tree makes different nuts that crack out, easier or harder. But every now and then you'll get a piece like what you can see in my hands right there that I'll have to put this back in the cracker to crack that last little piece open. But just from, a few seconds, a minute or so on the nutcracker, you can see I have all these huge pieces of black walnut that I get to enjoy. This is a pretty light colored black walnut. Like I said, they come in a whole range of colors, but they taste really, really good. That's the whole point of all this for me. Is just like, you can't get black walnut flavor anywhere other than a black walnut. It's nothing like the store-bought English walnuts. I think it's very complex and unique. It kind of has almost a floral or fruity thing going on, but people describe it in different ways. Everybody kind of perceives it differently. It's very nuanced and it's very strong, and I really, really like it. And good taste, does correlate to nutrition. We all know regular walnuts are very healthy for you. Black walnuts are even more healthy for you. Almost all of the beneficial compounds you find in English walnut are found in higher concentrations in the black walnut. So all the healthy fats and your vitamins and things like that, as well as protein. Of all the tree nuts, black walnut is apparently the highest protein content of any tree nut. So it's really healthy, really tasty snack. They store in the shell for an incredibly long amount of time. I mean, easily up to 5 years or more in the shell. Once you crack them, the shelf life is not nearly as long. But so these are shelf-stable, food security foods. They grow in abundance all over the place. They're free to gather. It does take a lot of time to process them, but they're free, delicious, healthy calories if you have the time and the interest to work with them. So one of my favorite trees for so many reasons. They're also very fast-growing trees. I think they're beautiful. And excited to talk more on black walnut, but thanks for stopping by for now. So I'm realizing somehow through all of this work with black walnuts and all this video taking and editing, I managed to not record any video of actual black walnut trees to share with you all. So a lot of you probably know what they look like, but if you don't, I would like to have at least a little bit of footage of the black walnuts so you can kind of get a gist of what they look like. And even if you do know what they look like, it's nice to look at them and just appreciate them. So I do have some clips of some smaller black walnut trees in the landscape, ones that are just coming to, nut-bearing age. They're pretty young, so not the big trees I'm doing a lot of collection from, but this is what they look like, this just to give you the gist. And also a few nursery trees here. I'm growing a lot of black walnuts in the nursery, so these are all first-year-old trees. And I am selling those. If you're looking to buy bare root black walnut trees, check out the website link in bio. I'm happy to send you some trees. So, oh yeah. We didn't even touch on uses for black walnut wood. It's a really beautiful wood for use in furniture making. It's a good firewood. It's very rot resistant. So high value wood as well. We can talk more about that in another video perhaps. I keep thinking I'm ready to be done editing, and then I keep deciding that there's more that I want to share and talk about with black walnut. But I think we'll end it with some cracking footage on the dedicated black walnut cracker. This brand is Roots and Harvest. If you want to look up where to buy it, Roots and Harvest is where I got mine. This is a good example of a walnut that's a little bit darker in color on the inside. I like this cracker. It works great if you want to get this one. There's other models out there. I think there's one called Grandpa's Goody Getter. So yeah, shop around black walnut cracker, find one that works for you, but the Roots and Harvest one is the one that I got. Or, just rock out with the hammer or rock, some rock on rock action. Totally works. You don't have to go spending money if you don't want to. You can totally get by without one of these dedicated crackers, but it is nice to have one in the kitchen.